AirBnBubble. Is this the pin that pops the property market? Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Insights brought to you by Ainslie Bullion and the Gold and Silver Standard. Today, we welcome back Alex, who's been looking at the housing crisis through the lens of short-term rentals and the impact they're having, as well as government stepping in to crack down on the sector, which could lead to unintended consequences. So how are you going today, Alex?
Going well. How are you going?
Yeah, good. So I thought this was a good angle today, and it was nice of you to sort of keep away from war and all that stuff that's going on in the background because we're all a little bit over, those constant stories, and this is something that's still quite important. So, can you maybe start us off today just talking about housing inflation because it's something we all can feel. Everyone knows that's going on. We've heard a lot of stories out of the US where people can't afford to downsize because the new loan, if they locked it in, it'll be they locked in their loan at lower rates. So if they lock in a new loan, it'll be much higher. And we know it's tight here. So what's going on overall?
So, looking the recent inflation figures out of the US and Australia, were lower, bounced up a little bit. So the US is now sitting around 4, Australia is sitting around 5. But what's feeding into these? The biggest one still in the US is housing. So their inflation in housing is still sitting at 7.2%, and Australia is sitting at 6.6%. So things like fuel are affecting Australia more than the US still, but it is the biggest proportion of inflation in the US, or the biggest number feeding into it. So it's really significant. And if you look at house prices, they're still not falling pretty much anywhere in the developed world at the moment. So Australia just keeps going up, US keeps going up. Now, the US has now dropped to the lowest existing home sales since 2006. So, in a population of about 350 million, they're only selling 4 million homes a year. And in Australia, the average mortgage, which is about $585,000, has risen by about $1,400 a month. So there's a lot of extra money going into the market with no gain because it's all being fed through the interest rates.
Yep. And I think that you just highlighted there that real problem they have in the US where people just don't want to sell because why would you if
8% mortgage rates now. So
yeah.
Australia is not there. So their 30-year mortgage rate is 8%, whereas their, COVID rate was at 2%. So it's crazy.
So it doesn't make any sense. And that backs up that number that you said. They're just not, people just aren't selling their houses.
But it doesn't back up the fact that house prices aren't falling in either market. It still makes no sense.
No, true. But I suppose one aspect of this that was really interesting from the article today, which might play into that discussion a little bit, was the Airbnb angle, because I thought that was quite interesting because it's not something people typically think about seeing a direct correlation to the housing market. But how are you seeing that the short stay accommodation is relevant to this discussion?
So, I mean, in Melbourne, for example, they've got about 17,000 houses or apartments that are on Airbnb. So it's a fairly sizable amount of the housing stock in so many cities right now that are going to short stay rentals. So, we've obviously spoken in depth about migration and what that's doing to housing prices. But, taking stock out of the market, which has been going on for years for short stay rentals, has taken away from the housing stock. So what's interesting, though, you speak to people now with Airbnbs, it appears that their bookings are dropping. It appears that their incomes are dropping. It just is starting to get harder to get people in for the rentals. And that's, even Airbnb was expecting about an 11% drop in short-term rental revenue. So they know it's coming. So you've got a drop in income that we know is coming. But then what the world has done because of the housing crisis is started putting a lot of regulation on short-term stays. So, for example, Melbourne, so Victoria last week announced a 7.5% levy that will be coming in 2025. Then Sydney has got maximum stays of 180 days a year. Then you've got cities like Barcelona that are saying a minimum stay is 31 days. And then in New York, The recent one is that the person has to be in the house unless you're registered, and they're not passing through the registrations very quickly. So there's a lot of stuff going on at the moment, which is regulating the hell out of the market to try and probably pull some of the short stay rentals back into the long-term rentals, or even to sell so people can start buying.
That's really those examples you gave are really interesting, because it's like every jurisdiction is trying a different approach, isn't it? That you've got some minimum, some adding maximum, some I mean, that one where you say people staying in there having to be in the house at the same time. I mean, that's quite interesting and quite different to what we expect today when you book an Airbnb.
Yeah, and that's New York. So New York is where Airbnb started, and
Yep.
they are now really cracking down on this because, I think, isn't it, they're spending $12 billion a year just on the migrants, housing them in hotels in the US, in New York alone at the moment.
Yes, I did
So
see
things
something like
have
that.
got,
Yeah.
yeah, so things have gotten really out of hand, and this is probably them trying to rein it in a bit.
Yep. Well, that makes sense. You also mentioned in the article, and it's relevant to what you were just talking about with the income angle, because Robert Kiyosaki, you referenced, and that's the Rich Dad Poor Dad. You know, a lot of people know Robert Kiyosaki because he really pushes this angle of assets are things that put money in your pocket. So if you're going to buy a house, then he would be arguing for things like Airbnb to say, well, there's a way that you can actually turn your house, which is a lot, most of us would consider the house an asset, but from his angle, it's not really an asset if it's your family home, because it's only draining money out of your pocket, as we all know. But that turns it into an actual income generating asset. So it's an interesting way to look at the world. What did you find from him and what he was saying around the impact of this on income, remembering that there would be a lot of people who look at it that way and are using their house for income here?
So Robert Kiyosaki came out recently and said Airbnb is going to be the cause for another crash. So his words were, if you want a new home, your happy days are around the corner. Same for rental property. The best time to get rich is in a crash. So he is saying that he believes house prices are going to fall, as well as rental incomes, which is really interesting for what we've been talking about. Because if, like we were saying, inflation in the US and in Australia and worldwide seems to be starting to tick up a little bit at the moment, and feeding into this is housing prices. Now, if they can successfully get rents down, and though that should feed disinflation into those numbers. And if they can do that, then maybe they can finally start dropping those mortgage rates that are hurting everyone so much. And, that will, in its own way, get inflation down, because your mortgage repayments won't be as high.
So there's potentially a bit of light at the end of the tunnel there. So the positive way we could look at this is that for those people, and we know there's lots of people who first home buyers or want to be first home buyers who've just had to be sitting and waiting on the sidelines because they haven't been able to afford it. So is this potentially the catalyst that does let that next generation come in actually with some level of housing affordability?
I think that would be relative, wouldn't it? Because it would be lovely to see that happen. But, the prices have gone up, 20, 30% since COVID. Like, things are just crazy. And, but, by bringing in the stock and allowing more houses to rent and for sale, then ultimately it should start to readjust prices to hopefully a reasonable level.
But that's a really good point. At a reasonable level might be a relative issue, where even a pullback from just how high they are at the moment may not be enough for those people who really have been waiting. So it could, that's the rich get richer dilemma here, I suppose, that
Well,
if it pulls back.
It's interesting because, you look at what happened in 2008, and there was a rapid decrease in rates there, which actually helped crash the property market, because people started selling because they could start moving stock again. Whereas in Australia, the rapid decrease helps escalate prices. So we're back to that same conundrum where variable rates will help the Australian market possibly more, and the US market possibly less. So, yeah.
Yeah,
see
very
which
good.
way they
A
all
very good
go.
point. We have to look at them that collectively there's a lot of macro stuff going on that impacts both, but we do have to look at them quite independently simply because of that nature of how they're set up.
Yeah, but hopefully the crackdown does bring, more stock available to the house market, and ultimately, no matter if you're in a variable market or in a fixed market at that point, that should help bring house prices down.
Yep. Okay. Well, there's a little bit of hope. I'll choose to interpret it that way anyway. A little bit of hope there. Well, thank you for that today, Alex. Really appreciate that deep dive on something that, like I say, there's a lot of other stuff going on in the world. So we still need to keep our eye on the ball for what's actually going on that impacts us. So thank you for that.
It's all impacting us, and hopefully it just all moves forward in a happy way.
Yeah, happy way. That's how we'll end today. Thanks everyone for watching. Remember, reach out if you've got any questions or comments on those social platforms. We love to hear those. That's us for today. We'll be back tomorrow with Branko to discuss all things markets and metals. Until then, have a great rest of the day, everyone.